The Celtic people were one of the first inhabitants of England and have mingled with many kinds of people like the Romans and the Germanics. Since the Celts were in England for the longest, you'll expect that English, the language known for borrowing, would be influenced significantly by Celtic languages. But in this presentation, we will show that it did influence English, but very insignificant.
Before we talk about the influence on England, I want to give background information on the Celts. Not much is known about the origin of the Celts, the original inhabitants of the British Isles, but it is accepted belief that the Celts originated in Middle Europe, above modern-day Italy, about 500 BC. The Celts arrived in Britain, where they stayed and later got conquered by the Romans. Then Germanic tribes began slowly migrating out to Britain, beginning in 430 AD, when the Celtic warlord Vortigern invited the Jutes to settle on the east coast of Britain to protect against sea raids by the Picts. In return, they were allowed to create settlements in the southern area of Kent, Hampshire, and the Isle of Wight. The Celts were eventually forced into western England, Wales, and Cornwall. Some crossed the English Channel in the 5th and 6th centuries to Brittany, and therefore are the root of a Celtic language there, Breton, which is spoken in French to present day. However, its English counterpart, Cornish, died out in the 1700s when its last native speaker died.
Even though I said in the previous section that a high population of Celts were present in the British Isles as Old English was being developed, it had a negligible effect on the vocab of Old English. This happened because invaders of England, like the Normans, tended to think that Celtic was not for the intellectuals and higher class people, because the Celts were considered barbarian and the Normans were civilized. Because of this, very few loanwords in English are Celtic. In fact, most of the loanwords in Old English are place names in England, like Thames, York, and Dover, and county names like Avon, Kent, and Cumberland. The rest of the loanwords in Old English that had Celtic origins came from the Irish who spoke Celtic. The reason Celtic influence spread was because of the strength of the Irish Christianity. As Irish missionaries spread Christianity, they introduced some Celtic religious terms like dry, which means magician, which comes from Old Irish as druid or druid, and the word cross, which appeared in Old English as cross. But all in all, the Celtic language had a very small impact on the vocabulary of English, but some people argue that the Celtic language actually influenced English grammar.
Although the traditional consensus among the linguist community is that the Celtic languages did not influence English beyond a few vocabulary words, contradicting arguments exist. The scholar John McWhorter dedicated a chapter of his work, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, to presenting evidence of the Celtic influence on modern English, and countered arguments made by the linguist mainstream.
Although most people may consider that English has nothing to do with Celtic, both of them share a common suffix, namely ing, and there were common sentence structures between Celtic and English. In Welsh, to say that Mary was singing, you would say Mae Mer Yin Kanu, meaning Mary isn't singing. In Old English, there are similar variations. If you were to say you were hunting, you would say I am on hunting. Although eventually I am on hunting was modified, as the word on wore down to result in I am hunting, Celtic and English have very obvious ties.
The use of a verb progressive tense is a shared commonality with Celtic languages and English, and yet this commonality is dismissed as a coincidence by the linguist mainstream. A similar commonality found between both Celtic and English is the meaningless do. The meaningless do is a very common form in English, and to native English speakers seems natural. The question, do you want to go eat, contains the meaningless do. So does the sentence, did you go to Umar's house? And the sentence, do you like dressing up for Halloween? The word do has no meaning in these sentences, however. Although it would sound weird to us to omit the do, from the linguist's perspective, the word do can be eliminated from each of these sentences, and the entire meaning of the sentence is preserved. For that very reason, most other languages don't have an equivalent of the meaningless do, and the meaningless do is actually quite rare outside of English. However, Celtic also has a meaningless do, and perhaps not so coincidentally, Celtic was spoken on the same island as English, before people spoke English.
However, people who believe that English randomly started using ing and do out of the blue base their beliefs over a specific aspect of history that could easily be wrong. Scholars assume that in AD 449, when the Germanic invaders brutally slaughtered all the Celts, the remaining Celts would not possibly have had an impact on language. McWhorter argues that it would be impossible to basically genocide an entire population with swords or even guns.
For Celtic culture to be completely annihilated after as few as 250,000 invaders from Germanic tribes conquered the British Isles is absurd. Cultural practices wouldn't dissolve so quickly, and the Celtic population wouldn't have been eradicated so easily either. Archaeologists have even found graves built with combined Celtic and Germanic customs, proving that the Germanic and Celtic populations did coexist for some point in history.
Even if Celts met Old English speakers between 450 CE to 650 CE, why don't Celtic grammatical structures appear in English until 13,000?
The reason that Celtic grammatical structures could have taken more than 800 years to appear in English writing is that for more than 800 years, English documents would have been written in a version of English completely different from what was spoken. Written language has always represented spoken language inaccurately, but the dissonance between a written language and its spoken counterpart would have been much greater 1,000 years ago than now. Throughout history, written documents wouldn't be written by peasants or about everyday things. Rather, written documents would be created by higher-class people and often would function as legal documents or recollections of old folklore. Thus, proportionately few literate people would be scholars compared to the peasant population, and all these educated scholars would practice writing language in a different form than what was spoken. Scholars would write by imitating previous documents, so it could take a long time before written scripts would represent colloquial speech. Thus, it is possible that Celtic grammatical influences could have not been seen in English writings for over 800 years, since English scholars and writers would be writing a form of English that existed prior to Celtic exposure.
It could be similar to Dante using French in Italy and preserving it for 150 years. Even after the Italian left, many were comfortable writing French. Although we do not have definite proof that this is what happened, several facts point that there is no way that millions of Celts could have been annihilated with only a few left hiding in Wales and Cornwall. A theory backed up by facts are that the Celtics, although under domination and power, spoke the Germanic language but closely modified and shaped it, then passed it on to future generations. After the French conquered, English was not spoken, but when it was changed and possessed strains of Celtic speak.
Though a handful of scholars like McWhorter think that Celtic grammar influenced English grammar, the general consensus remains that Celtic languages were ultimately of little consequence in English, beyond a few location names and religious words. Nevertheless, possible Celtic influence on English is not a closed topic. Because the Celts have assimilated into many cultures that influence English, to disregard the possibility of Celtic influence would be brash. Evidence in favor of Celtic influence has not been totally dismissed, and short of a time machine, we may never truly know how greatly or how little the Celts impacted and interacted with the English language and culture.
Ta-da! The end.